Okay. I guess I'm live. All right, I guess I'm live now. Anyway, I guess I should continue watching this. For now, at least.
Skip the cut page and go to the edit page, because if you have edited video, this is going to be a lot more comfortable for you to jump into this page rather than the cut page. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So like I said, the edit page, this is what you would think of as a editor. Like if you can think of an editing app, something like Final Cut, Premiere, Vegas, that kind of mindset, that's what's happening here in the edit page. And it's a fully featured, just as amazing as those apps, and in my opinion, a lot better actually, but it's just one part of Resolve, which is just nuts, okay? Anytime that we switch to a new page, we have kind of a different layout with our panels. We still have the buttons up here that'll help us close and open the different panels. And we even have our media pool, which we've already used in the media page. It's just kind of put here on the left instead of down here on the bottom. But it works the same way. You can right click and make bins. You can right click here in the empty space and do all kinds of fun stuff, import things, make new timelines, all kinds of good stuff. We even have our smart bins and everything. I'll just move those up so you can see them. In a similar way to our media page, if I go over to my media pool and mouse over a clip, it plays here in the viewer. If I double click on the clip, I can play it back here in the viewer without it going away. So this viewer right here, this is called the source viewer. And you can think of it as looking at a little part of your project. So looking at just this clip in the media pool, right? The viewer to the right, this is our timeline viewer. And that represents what the person who watches your movie is actually going to see. And of course, right now it's empty. And the reason for that is we don't have anything in the timeline. The timeline is this section down here. And this is where you put together your story, your sequence of clips in order to make a video, right? There are a lot of ways that you can make a new timeline and add clips to it and everything. I think one of the easiest ways is just to pick one of your clips, grab it in the middle like this, and then just drag it down to the timeline. What that's going to do is make a new timeline, and we can see this showing up here in our media pool. In fact, let's right click and say new bin, and we'll call this timelines. And I'm not going to have this under my footage bin. I'm going to drag this under master like that. So we just have a bin here called timelines under our master. And then under footage here, let's grab this timeline, and I'm just going to drag that to the timelines bin. So now our timeline 1 is in our timelines bin, okay? But now we have the timeline, and if I drag this playhead, then we have stuff showing up here in the timeline viewer. So if I were to render this out, that means if I were to turn this into an actual video and not just a project that I can open and resolve, if I were to render this out, people would see exactly this. A whole bunch of black. Yep. Followed by this clip. So if we want our story to be different than that, we have to do some work here in the timeline. One thing to note is there are a couple different sections here. We have the video track and the audio track. And by default, if I just drag a clip down to the timeline, those are linked and I can grab them and just move them around. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to move it all the way to the left. That's going to make sure that I don't have any space. And so if I drag this all the way to the left and this timer says 0, I play it back and we're immediately seeing something, right? That's a good start. That's a good start. But let's say that I don't like the beginning of this. Well, I can play this back to about where I'd want to start. So maybe right here. And then what I can do is I can grab the edge of this. I'm just mousing over the edge. So it turns into this little bracket with the kind of little film strip thing. And I can grab this and just drag this over to the playhead. And that's going to chop off that first part. Of course, now I have a gap. So I could either grab this and move it to the left, or I can select this empty space and hit backspace. That's going to move that down. And I could do the same thing for the end. Let's say I want it to stop there. I can drag that in. That's called trimming a clip. So we've trimmed it to be exactly the length that we want.
I don't hear him use any external buttons. So I'm guessing that makes it more simple than Premiere. I mean, it seems to be more simple than Premiere.
Let's add another clip.
But I don't know.
Just go over to footage, double click on this clip here. And again, I could just click this image and drag it down anywhere I want and move it around in the timeline. But let me show you something cool. If I grab this image, I can drag it over here to the right on my viewer, and I have a few different options for adding this to the timeline. One that I like is append at end. So if I drag this over append at end, what it will do is throw it at the very end of the sequence, like that. Some of these, it's really important where my playhead is. And so if my playhead is in between two clips, I could grab a clip like this, drag this over and select insert. And what that'll do is that'll put it in between the two clips, right there where the playhead is. But yeah, what I like about append at end is it doesn't really matter where my playhead is. I can just put it somewhere random and I can just drag this to append at end and it's going to throw it there at the end, which is great if you're just trying to get a bunch of footage into the timeline so that you can start working with it. Other big things you need to know. If you want to split a clip, so like chop it in half, you can do that a couple different ways. One way is you can select this blade tool, click this, and anywhere that I click here on this track, it's going to chop it, okay? And it'll kind of snap to the playhead if I want to chop it right there. Then I can switch back to regular selection mode and I can move things down and this looks like two clips, right? So I can put things in between them, move them around, that kind of thing. But what you really want to do if you want to edit quickly inside of Resolve is learn some keyboard shortcuts, okay? One of the big keyboard shortcuts is if you select kind of where you want to chop your clip here with this playhead, and if you hit Control B, that's going to split that clip right there under the playhead. So Control B, anytime you want, Control B, you can just chop up that clip. This is very, very useful. Another shortcut, kind of a bonus one, is let's say that I want to trim this clip like this and then move the clip down like that. So we're just trimming the front of it and then moving it down so there isn't a gap. Check this out. I can do this all in one foul swoop, or however you say that, by hitting Control Shift left bracket. That's going to kind of chop off the end there. Same thing for the other side, Control Shift right bracket will chop off the end of that. That is a keyboard shortcut that I use all the time. It's super useful, but I actually don't use it quite like that. I set a custom keyboard shortcut so that it's a little bit easier. If you go to the upper left-hand corner of DaVinci Resolve and click on DaVinci Resolve, you can go down to keyboard customization. This is a very nice little utility that lets you customize your keyboard. Who'd have thought? And if you select any key, it will tell you what it's a shortcut for. So instead of Control Shift left bracket, which is start to playhead, I'll just click on this to bring it up here on the right. I want to set a new keyboard shortcut. And to do that, I'm just going to hit plus here and I'm going to do Q for this, just Q. It's going to say, oh no, it's already assigned to stuff. It's fine. Just say assign. And same thing for end to playhead. Instead of Q, we're going to say W. Assign this. Great. Now, one thing I'll need to do is get rid of my other Q and W shortcuts. So I'll just go to Q, and here under application, it says source and timeline viewer. I'm just going to get rid of this. Just click this little X. Same for W, dynamic trim mode. I'm going to turn that off. I like Q and W for ripple, start and end to playhead. That's kind of chopping off the beginning and the end. The other thing I like to do is take this Control B, which is razor, right? Let's go here. Instead of razor, Control B, let's just add S. By default, it's toggle slip and slide, which I never use. So I'll hit assign. And again, let's just go to S here where it says toggle slip and slide. And I get rid of that. Great. Now we'll hit save. We'll call this Casey for our preset name and hit OK. Now we're set up just with my left hand on the Q, W, and S keys. I can split really easily, and I can hit Q to trim the beginning and then W to hit the end. So what I like about this is I can go through any clip and I can easily just split and trim, split and trim, split and trim, and make a lot of edits without having to do a whole lot. I can cut out a bunch of silence, whatever I want to do. It's a good time. It's a great time. So let's get serious here and kind of start actually making a little edit. And before we even really worry about that, I'm actually going to go ahead and get rid of this timeline. I'm just going to hit delete just so we have no timelines, because what we should really do is take a look at the project settings. If I go over to the lower right-hand corner of the interface, there's this little cog. If you click on that, that'll bring up your project settings. Really important to go through and be somewhat familiar with your project settings before you add a bunch of footage, because you want to make sure that you have your frame rate and all that stuff set. We're actually going to keep our frame rate at 24 and our playback rate at 24. The one thing I'm going to do, just because we have a certain size of footage here, is instead of 1920 by 1080, I'm going to say 1920 by 800. And this is our timeline resolution. This is just going to give us kind of a widescreen format, and everything else is probably fine to leave at defaults. And we might dive back into project settings here in a minute, but let's just hit save. The most important part is this timeline resolution and frame rate. Let's hit save. And now our black bars disappear from the top and bottom because we're working with the actual resolution of the clips. So you always want to set your resolution for your timeline just to whatever you want to deliver in. So that means the final video, what you want that to look like. So now that we have that set, I'm going to right click and say timelines, create new timeline, and we'll call this edit 1. Okay. Double click on that to open up our timeline, and let's go to our footage and let's start placing some footage here. This first clip of our Jedi walking up, I think we'll go ahead and grab that. But let's say that I don't want to take this entire clip down into the timeline and then chop it up. I want just a little part of it. Well, I can kind of select that by scrubbing through and figuring out where I want this to start. And then I can either hit this little button right here, which is the mark in button, or I can hit I on the keyboard, I for in. And then we'll go through, and about when we want this to end, I'm going to hit O for out. I can also click this little mark out button. I can take that, put that in my timeline however I want, make sure it's sucked all the way to the left, and hit spacebar to play back. And now we have our first shot. It's looking pretty good. If I want to zoom out, I can either use this little slider right here to zoom in and out. I can also hit Control plus and minus on the keyboard. I can also hold Alt and roll with my scroll wheel to zoom in or out. So I usually just roll with my scroll wheel holding Alt. Now let's pick our second clip, which let's go ahead with this one right here, where our Jedi and our Sith are looking at each other. Start this about here, I for in, and when it's done, I'll hit O for out. And again, I can drag this to the timeline like this, or I can drag it over this right viewer, and I'll just say append at end. And we're just going to line out the basic shots for our movie. And depending on the type of video you're doing, you know, if you have something scripted like this, you can just pick the shots and kind of put them in order. If it's more of a documentary, then you might be picking interviews first. And I'm going to put on my headphones because we're about to listen to some audio here. And I'll make sure that this little speaker icon here is activated and it's not orange like this.
I'm here for the droid.
We have some audio here with this one. And I'm going to hit an I for in, O for out, and I'll drag this in. Now, if I hold Alt and zoom in here, I can even grab the little dividers here on our tracks and I can move this up. And I can kind of arrange these dividers so that we scale up this audio so that we can see that waveform really nicely. And this is a great way to edit, especially if you're doing something like an interview. You want to make sure you see those audio waveforms because a lot of the time you're kind of cutting to that.
I'm here for the droid.
All right. Now that's pretty good, except for it's just in the left ear for whatever reason. And so there are a few different ways we can fix that. Probably the easiest way is just to right click on our track here on this track header and go down to change track type to, and instead of stereo, let's just select mono. And that's going to play this.
I'm here for the droid.
Out of both ears. So we have that. Then we're going to have his response. And we'll just grab this because there's not actually any audio here. We're going to put the audio in post. So he responds like, oh yeah, well, you
can't have him. He's mine. I own him now.
And then we'll have the final shot of them running towards each other.
2, 1, action.
And we'll chop that. And we're going to cut right there where those lightsabers hit. Boom, right there. And I can hit Control Shift right bracket or what I've set as W to just chop off the end of this like that. And now we have our basic edit. And we have a story. We put this together in the edit page. And it's very nice. Very nice. Yes.
Sorry. Line. 3, 2, 1. I'm here for the droid.
Okay. So now that we have our basic kind of rough edit, we need to do a little bit of tweaking here. One thing is we hear the director talking on this shot, so we don't want that. So I can just grab this line. This is the volume line, and I can just drag this all the way down. That'll turn the volume down for the clip. Another thing I can do is select the clip and go over to the inspector. Just click on this inspector button, and that will bring up this right panel. And if I want to make a panel bigger, there's this little kind of a arrow box button. If I click that, that'll make it full height instead of just half height like that. The inspector is a panel that is common to almost all of the pages in Resolve. And you can think of it this way. If you select something, you can adjust its properties in the inspector. Like any kind of details about a clip or an effect or, an audio clip or a piece of media, whatever you have selected, you're adjusting the properties of in the inspector. So I can select this clip and there's a couple different tabs up here. I can go to the audio tab and here we see our volume is all the way down. So this is the same control as that line here in the interface. We can kind of see it moving up and down actually when I move this slider. That's just a quick way to adjust that slider, right? So I can bring that all the way down. And there are all kinds of really powerful things you can do in the inspector. It's like, just in the audio, you can adjust the volume, the pan. If you have the paid version of Resolve, you can turn on some really cool voice isolation or dialogue leveler effects that have to do with kind of sweetening your voice or making it loud enough compared to the other things that might have been recorded. We can pitch things up or down. We can change the speed. We can even add an equalizer just to this clip. There's a lot you can do just right here in the inspector of just this clip. Pretty wild. Similar for video. This is where we can zoom things in or out. We can change its position. We can rotate stuff. And you can double click on any of these words to reset them. You can also hit this little reset button here. You can crop any clip here with cropping. There's dynamic zoom, which just kind of zooms in or out over the duration of the clip, and you don't have to animate it yourself or anything like that. It just automatically does it, which is really nice. We have composite modes. If you want to do something like blend one image over another, I can just hold Alt and drag this up, and that's going to copy this clip. So I'll just put this over it, and then we'll change this composite mode to something like add. And see, now we have these kind of laid over each other. And so you can use like layer-based effects and stuff here in the edit page, and you have as many tracks as you pretty much want. You can make just tons and tons of tracks, and they're video layers basically, right? You can do some really powerful stuff here just in the edit page. There's even easy ways to stabilize footage or do lens correction. It's crazy. The other kind of major part of the edit page that we haven't really touched on yet is the effects panel. Here, kind of behind our media pool, we have the effects. If I click on that, that will bring up our effects panel here. I'll just close the media pool so we have this full height panel. And there are all kinds of different things. This is where you'll find your video transitions, audio transitions, your titles, ways to generate bars, and all kinds of stuff, different effects. And all of these work pretty much the same. If you have a transition, you could just drag this in between two clips and it will do a transition. Same works with audio. If you have a title, you can just grab one of the titles and drag it down into an empty track. And then that's going to play back with your title. Just like properties of clips, I can select this title and go over here to the inspector and adjust everything about the title. Everything from the font to the size to the color, all of that stuff. And there's really a lot you can do just with the built-in titles here on the edit page. They even have scrolling credits. Oh, baby. There it is. We also have quite a few Fusion titles, which are a little bit more fancy because they're using the power of the Fusion page. And so, you know, we have stuff like Digital Glitch, which comes in, has this really cool kind of glitchy effect.
What? Wait, is that? Is that included? I think DaVinci Resolve is better.
That's pretty fun. And again, you can select that and adjust all of its properties here in the inspector. If there's an effect that you want to apply to a clip, you can just take it and drag it directly onto the clip like this. And that's going to actually use that piece of footage and apply an effect to it. And of course, selecting the clip and going over to the effects tab here gives you controls over it, right? Whatever you have selected, you can adjust the details here in the inspector, okay? Just what's in the edit page, there is so much. I mean, it's crazy. And what's great about this is if this is really kind of the level of videos that you're making, if you really don't need anything other than a way to trim your clips and move things around and make a story, do some really basic titles and adjust your audio a little bit, you could just stay in the edit page. It's totally okay to just stay in the edit page. In fact, if you wanted to export this movie, which, you know, let's pretend it's great, we can go up to File and down to Quick Export. And here's a window that gives us a simple way just to export various different presets. You know, they have one for YouTube and Vimeo and TikTok and all of those. And that's a quick way just to export right here from the edit page without going into any other pages. In fact, you could go up to Workspace and just uncheck Show Page Navigation, and then boom, this is your editor, right? So if you're used to other stuff, you don't want to get overwhelmed by the other pages, you can just stay in the edit page and make your videos this way. So it's really nice and simple if you want it to be. But the thing that's really cool about Resolve is it can do so much more. I mean, it's insanely powerful, especially the things that you can do in the Fusion and the color page and Fairlight page. But before we get into that, let's take a trip over to the cut page. Now, this is interesting because all of the pages in Resolve, they all share the same timeline, which means that you don't have to export or round trip or do anything into other apps to kind of do more specialized things. You can just click on the different pages and stuff shows up here in the page that's from your original timeline, right? And the same's true with the cut page. If I click on the cut page, here we have our timeline just like we had in the edit page, but it's a little bit of a different interface. We aren't going to spend tons and tons of time on the cut page. This is a really neat page for some workflows, and I'll show you some of my favorite things that I like to use it for. But first, really the idea behind the cut page is for speed. So all of these things that we're doing in the edit page, like, you know, moving things around, zooming in, adjusting things, you know, zooming back out, going to a different part, like all of that takes a little bit of time, and over again, it kind of adds up. And so the cut page, the idea behind the cut page is that you don't have to do those little things that take up time. You can just focus on editing your video, which for a somewhat simple video can be a huge time saver. So because it's designed for speed, there is no zooming in or out on the timeline. We have two views of the same timeline. This upper timeline is the entire timeline from beginning to end, from left to right, right? So I can instantly jump from the end of the timeline to the beginning of the timeline just with one click, and wherever I want in between. If I want to get really detailed, I'm already zoomed in here on the lower part of the timeline, and I can trim my clips and move things around in a more detailed way. Okay. The other thing is, by default, you won't be able to make a gap in the cut page. So if I were to trim this over, you see it kind of just moves the rest of the clips down to fill that gap. And so it makes it nice because if all you're doing is just going through and kind of cutting out time, you can pretty quickly go through and just be like, all right, I'm going to cut right before his audio and then right after his audio. And you don't have to worry about, blading something and trimming it and moving things down and all that stuff. It just saves time. Now, by default, when we play this back, this upper timeline, its playhead is going to move, and the lower timeline moves under the playhead. And so we have one playhead going from left to right, and then on the bottom, we have the timeline kind of going under the playhead. And you can change that if you want to. I like it this way because then I don't have two timelines moving around and it just gets more confusing. But there's these buttons right here. These are all the different options for the cut page. So the timeline options, there's all kinds of different options here that have to do with your view and the way that you work on the timeline. The second icon is the timeline actions. These are different actions you can take for the clips in your timeline, adding tracks, detecting cuts, creating subtitles, that kind of thing. Speaking of subtitles, if you have a video where you want to create subtitles, maybe for a social post or something like that, this will automatically create subtitles for you. Just click on Create Subtitles from Audio. And it'll give you some options here, but usually you can just hit create. And it'll go through your whole timeline and it will figure out all of the dialogue, which for us is going to be really easy because it's only one line. But it will do, the entire timeline with all the lines and everything. And it uses AI to be a little bit more accurate. And this subtitle generation, I believe, is only in the paid version of Resolve. So if you're using the free version, you can do 99% of what I'm showing you here today, but this feature is only in the paid version. Also, somewhat related, if you right click on any clip here in the media pool, again, just in the paid version, you can go to audio transcription and transcribe. And that'll go through and transcribe all of the audio in that clip. And you can even select different words and add those to the timeline just with that audio transcription, just to pick certain parts. So that's great if you have an interview where you have a certain line, you can just go through and select the line and just throw that into the timeline. That's a really neat way to work. Again, only in the paid version of Resolve. Let's go ahead and remove this effect. And again, you'll see some familiar panels here in the cut page. We have the inspector just like normal. We have our media pool, which is very similar. The one difference being there are these buttons here, and these are a lot like the buttons that we find when we drag over the viewer here in the edit page. The difference is that some of these are smart buttons. Let's say I want to put another shot of our Jedi here in between these two shots. Again, this is all about saving time, right? So I could make sure that I'm right in between those clips and double click the clip that I want and then insert that clip. And that's going to go in between the two clips. But notice something. I have this little indicator here that's selecting the nearest cut. And so I don't even have to be directly on that cut. I can just be close to it. And it's going to know that if I'm going to insert something, I want to put it right there. That's why this is called Smart Insert. So now I can hit Smart Insert and it's going to put that there without me having to be exactly right. So again, just time saving, right? And so these edit buttons just make it a little bit quicker. Same with these transitions. Wherever the closest cut is, if I click on this button right here, that's going to change that transition into a fade without me having to actually drag a transition onto it or hit a keyboard shortcut or anything like that. I can just be near this edit point and then click on this dissolve button to add a dissolve. And then of course I can change the dissolve length. If I select the dissolve and go up to the inspector, I have some options I can change. And so I really like the cut page. I actually use the cut page quite a bit. There are some people who, aren't really feeling the cut page. They like to stay in the edit page. There's no wrong answer. It just depends on what you like. I want to show you a couple more things about the cut page before we get into the other pages. One of them being these buttons up here. You'll notice that we only have one viewer here, and depending on what we have selected, it'll switch to being the source viewer, which is just viewing something from the media pool. Or if we click down in the timeline, that'll switch to a timeline viewer, which is what people who watch our movie are going to see. And I can even switch with these buttons, clicking on the left for the source viewer or on the right for the timeline viewer. But the middle one is called source tape. Now, source tape is really cool because what it does is it takes all of these clips and it puts them together sort of in one little mini timeline here in this play bar. And so I can easily scrub through all of the clips that are in whatever bin I'm looking at, which right now is just my footage bin. And I can easily just like page through, I mean, hundreds of clips if I want to. And I can set an in and an out with INO, and I could append this at end or whatever I want to do. And it's just a really quick way to select a bunch of stuff. This is perfect for if you're editing a documentary and you're looking for B-roll. I go through and find B-roll on this. And you can use this button, place on top, to put B-roll over. So like, let's say this is an interview and I want to put some B-roll over it. I can go through here, find some good B-roll. Let's just say he's walking, right? I-O, and then I can place on top this button right here. And then boom, that's going to put that B-roll over my interview, which is going to work great. And again, just saves time. There is a lot more to show you in the cut page, but we got to keep moving here. The cut page is actually really good at multicam edits. And if you want a good example of that, I'm going to go ahead and link my 4-hour masterclass for Resolve, which is right up there, where we go a little bit deeper in how to do multicam edits in the cut page as well as the edit page. And if you're really interested in some of the more detailed things with these pages, cannot recommend that video enough. It's been really helpful and it's perfect for beginners. But for now, we're just going to go back to our edit page, and I'm going to get rid of some of these transitions. We're going to make sure our edit is just about right. Okay. Now let's get into some fancy stuff. Resolve is an excellent editor, but that's just like a quarter of what it can do. The major power in Resolve is in the Fusion, Color, and Fairlight pages. So we're going to jump into Fusion next, but before we do that, let's jump into just a little bit of color. You may have noticed that this footage is kind of gray and washed out. That's because this is shot in log, which if you don't know, log is kind of this gray, nasty looking footage that basically crams as much data as it can into a regular video signal so that you have more flexibility with your color grading later. The problem is that it looks terrible until you do some work on it. So how do we deal with that? Well, the beautiful thing about Resolve is that it has color management built in. And if you don't know what color management is, it's basically a way to take this footage that is nasty log looking footage and turn it into as close as possible to kind of what you saw when you shot the footage, like what it would look like in real life, which is a great starting point for doing some more creative work with your color grades. And you know, you can even do this at the beginning of your project if you don't want to look at log footage. We want to set up some color management. So the way that we do that is go down to the lower right-hand corner and select project settings. This third item down is color management, and it says color science. So by default, this is DaVinci YRGB, which basically means that it's not going to do any color management. It's just like normal, what you would think of as video editing, video color handling, right? But if we click this and switch to DaVinci YRGB color managed, that is going to do some magic for us. Even if you know nothing about color management, it's totally okay just to click automatic color management, SDR Rec 709, unless you're making something for like an actual movie theater or for a really specialized output of some kind. You're probably going to want to pick Rec 709. That's the color space that is used on YouTube and on TV and probably most things that you're going to view things on. Okay. SDR Rec 709 works fine. And then all we do is go down and hit save. Nothing happens so far. The reason for that is because we've switched this like into smart mode. We switched this into take care of the colors mode, but depending on the footage that you have, Resolve might recognize the footage or it might not. And whether it does or doesn't, you can always go to the media pool, select your footage. I'll just drag and select all of these, right click and go down to input color space. And this is where you can tell Resolve what camera you shot this on. And there is support for a ton of different cameras. So, you know, if you're shooting on Sony, maybe you shoot S-Log3. You're shooting Nikon, maybe you're shooting N-Log. Canon, there's C-Log, right? I'm shooting Blackmagic Design, and they have a bunch of different ones. I'm shooting Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5. So look what happens when I click this. Baby. Oh, look at these shots. They're so much better looking. It just automatically makes it look normal. It doesn't necessarily look good. It's going to look how you shot it. All right. So if you shot it underexposed, it's going to be underexposed. If you shot it with stupid lighting, it's not going to look good. But it is going to look correct for how you shot it. right? Which is a great starting point. So this is great because we can edit this and we can do all of our stuff not looking at that ugly log footage. So good. We'll get into getting a little bit more creative with this and actually kind of finessing the colors to make them look good later. But for now, this is a pretty good approximation of like, you know, at least kind of normalizing our colors. But let's have some fun. This is a Star Wars movie. We need some lightsabers, right? So I'm actually just going to go to this last shot here where they're running at each other with these lightsabers. And we're going to start working on this in Fusion. Now, the way that we're going to do that is we're just going to look at this clip here in the edit page. We're just going to be over it and then go down to the bottom of our interface and click on Fusion. What that's going to do is load this clip into the Fusion page so that we can work with it. And again, Fusion is where you get really detailed with your effects and your animations, basically anything fancier than just like a really basic title or, you know, just throwing an effect on something. Anything that's kind of fancy, you pretty much do in Fusion. And so a perfect example would be creating lightsabers. Let's have a little tour of the interface. Here, kind of the most obvious thing is our viewer. And we actually have two viewers in Fusion, the left viewer and the right viewer. And it kind of seems like the viewers here in the edit page, the source viewer and the timeline viewer. It's almost like that, but it's not quite like that. For now, that's good enough. I'll explain a little bit more later. We have our timeline down here and we can scrub through our shot. I can zoom in using these little dots because these little yellow lines, these are the beginning and the end of our shot, the in and the out. And so I can kind of scale this up to where the beginning and the end, where the in and the out just take up this entire ruler here. And now I can see everything that's happening in the shot. Down below, we have our playback controls. So I can play this back, can loop it, all of that. We have some familiar things like up here in the upper left, we have our media pool. We have an effects library. Over to the right, we have our inspector. But what the heck is this? What's all this? Why is all this? Oh no. Why is there a flowchart happening? These are the Fusion nodes. And this is kind of the hardest part about learning Fusion, but it's also the most exciting. It's like when you get a brand new fancy car and it has all the fancy little doodads and everything, but it kind of seems overwhelming at first. And you're like, what do I even do? How do I put up the windows? Like there's a touch screen. What's happening? And this is kind of similar. These nodes down here, this is how we create basically everything in Fusion. Because in Fusion, we're doing a lot of combining images and adjusting images. And you usually think of like a photo editing app for that might have layers, right? So you can kind of think of layers sort of like in the edit page, we have all these different video tracks which we can stack as layers, right? And if you've been around media for a little while, you're probably used to something like that where, you know, this layer goes on top and if I move it out, and then I can kind of stack things just like I would stack things in normal life. Just like I were making like a collage or something like that, I would put all these different layers on top of each other. Well, Fusion doesn't really have layers. It uses nodes. And nodes are less like a stack of layers and are more like a flowchart or a series of steps. And so down here in the node graph, what we're doing is we're building a series of instructions and we're telling Fusion to do things in a series. And by default, if we open up a clip from the timeline, it's going to have a really simple set of instructions to start out with. It has a node called media in and a node called media out. The media in node has one job. All nodes pretty much have one job. The media in node's job is to take a piece of media from the timeline and bring it into Fusion. The media out's job is to take whatever we connect to that media out and bring it into the edit page again, bring it back into the timeline. And then all of the fanciness happens in between. Up here, we have our toolbar. And this isn't like a toolbar where you click and it changes your mouse. This is a toolbar where if you click and drag a new node into the graph, just by grabbing this icon and kind of dragging it in like this. So I'm going to get rid of this and do it again. I'm going to grab this blur. And this time I'm going to drop it in between these two nodes on this line. And when it turns yellow and blue, I can let go of it. And as I move this, you can see it's connected. It's really important that you understand that you have to connect the nodes together or else they don't talk to each other, right? But I can select this blur, and with it selected, I can go to the inspector and push up this blur size, and look what it does is it blurs the image. And so what we're doing is we're taking the image from the timeline, just as is, and then we're blurring it, and then we're putting it back on the timeline. So what do I mean by that? Well, anything that's connected to media out, that actually goes directly back into the edit timeline. So if I switch over to edit, look, we have our blurry footage. So we don't have to render it out. We don't have to export it or convert it or anything like that. It just already lives in the timeline. That's what's so powerful about Fusion. So cool. Okay. So anytime.
What? So it's better than After Effects? Well, in the sense that the workflow is more
Time that we switch to Fusion, we're just switching to fancy effects and animation mode. If you can wrap your head around this, that we grabbed this piece of media, then we're blurring it, then we are putting it back. That's kind of the essentials of how NodeFlow works. Let's say we wanted to put some text over this. Well, we can grab a text node. That's going to make text. It's going to be a problem if we try and run this through a text node. It would seem like that's what you do, but look what happens. What's going on there? Well, if I select this and I add some text, great. We see the text, but it's not being put over anything. It's not being applied to anything. So what's the deal with that? Well, a text node is actually making an image that looks like this. It's generating an image of text. And when you have an image, you can't run an image through an image like you would an effect like this blur node. What you have to do is you have to put an image over another image. And you do that with a special node called a merge node. So here to the right of our second divider, we have this little tool called merge. You can bring this in and you notice that some of these nodes have these different little triangles and a little gray square. These are the inputs and the outputs of a node. Depending on the color, those have different meanings, different kinds of inputs. So for our merge, we have a background. If we mouse over this, you can kind of see the little label, merge background, and then merge one, the green one is the foreground, and the blue one is the effect mask, and the little gray square is the output. And so what we can do is take the output from our blur and plug that into the background. That's the yellow input. Now I'll take this text, unhook this just by clicking on the lines. I'll take the text and I'll plug the output of the text into the foreground like this. And then I take the output of the merge and put that into media out. And now look what happens. Now we have some text over our background. So we're sort of getting there, right? We have our text over the background. We've made an official composite, which means putting an image over another image. And again, reminder, if we go to the edit page, we have this text over our blurry image, just like we did in Fusion. Switch back to Fusion. Now, if you're new to Fusion, you're probably saying, gosh, that is a ton of work to put text over something. Like I have to be a scientific genius to like hook up all of these nodes and everything. The good news is that it's not quite as bad as I just showed you because there's a lot of shortcuts and everything. So if I take this merge out, I'm just going to select it and hit delete. Instead of running this blur through this text, I can take the output of this text like this and drag that over the output of the blur. So this little white square, and check what happens. It does all of that I just did in one motion. Okay. What's cooler than that is if I have the blur selected and then I just click on text like this, it's going to do all that for me. It's going to kind of put it wherever it wants, but it already has the text made and merged over our blur. And now I can type right there. Now, one thing I would do once you start working with nodes is I would right click on the background here. And we have a couple of options for how the nodes are organized. I like to check to connected and uncheck auto arrange. Okay, so your options should look like that if you want to be like me, because now if I arrange these to connected, they kind of snap to each other like this, and it just looks a lot nicer. Oh, it just looks so nice. By the way, I can click and drag with my scroll wheel, like pushing down on my scroll wheel on my mouse to kind of grab these and move them around. And you're going to be doing a lot of that in Fusion. And actually you can do that in the viewers, in all of the different pages. It's very, very useful. If you don't have a 3-button mouse, a mouse with the actual scroll wheel in the middle, you need to get one. They're $12 on Amazon. That is the best investment you can make in your DaVinci Resolve career. Please do that. Please do that. No, there's no good macro things. No, there's no good things for anything else. Just freaking get a 3-button mouse, please. I know you like your Magic Mouse. Get a 3-button mouse to work in Resolve, okay? Okay, end of discussion. And now that we have this, I can show you a little bit more about these viewers. So this viewer on the right, this is sort of like our timeline viewer at the moment. And the reason for that is because we have our media out 1 viewed on the right. remember that's what is going to be shown in our timeline. So it kind of works out. But for either of these viewers, we can view any one of these nodes. And so I could take the text 1 and I could just drag this up into the viewer and let go. And that's going to show me just the result of text 1, exactly the image that's being made by that node. Okay. Same thing for blur. I could drag that in and that gives us the blurry image. Or I can look at this even earlier before the blur. And this is really such a powerful thing because you can kind of dismantle what each node is doing by viewing it on a different viewer. So it's really nice to be able to troubleshoot things this way. And this is sort of like a non-linear approach. If you have a stack of layers, it's hard to view that layer kind of by itself in most apps, but this is a way to be able to do that here with any node in our flow. So what I like to do most of the time is just keep media out here on the right viewer, even though it could be anything. I like to keep that in the right viewer because I'm used to that being the timeline viewer basically. And then I can view any other parts here on the left viewer. So it's really easy to see like a before and an after, right? So cool. Now we're just going to learn kind of the minimum amount of node stuff today. But if you're getting into Fusion, Fusion is what I do. Fusion is my jam. I love teaching people Fusion. I have multiple courses on Fusion. I have tons of videos on Fusion. So if you want to learn Fusion, you've come to the right place. And if you're brand new to nodes, I would recommend checking out this video all about how the heck nodes work. It's a lot of fun. I explain it using Toast, which I think is a good time. Anyway, we want to make some lightsabers, don't we? So let's get rid of this stuff. And again, what's cool about Fusion is, I mean, you can do absolutely anything. Anything is possible in Fusion. I'm going to hold Control and scroll here, and let's just make a lightsaber real quick. You can do this a bunch of different ways, but one way that is pretty easy is if I grab this far right icon, this background icon, grab this, drag it over here. I can take the output of it and drag it over my media in one like this. And that's going to make a merge node. And it's going to put my background over my media in, which is going to give me a black screen because we're generating a black background. Instead, let's generate a kind of a cyan background. So I'll just push up these colors here in my inspector with my background selected, but I've just generated a color over everything. And I don't really want that. I just want it to be where the lightsaber is. And so what we can do is use this little mask input to limit where we draw that background. And we can do that by connecting any of these icons here, which are the mask tools. So for instance, I could take a rectangle and take the output of that and put that into the blue input of the background. And look at this. Now we're limiting where that color shows up to be just inside of that rectangle that we're drawing on the screen with this rectangle node. Because I have this selected, I can adjust this and move this around here in the viewer. And, you know, if I wanted to, I could size this and I'll kind of hold Control and zoom in and move this around and adjust this and everything to be sort of lightsabery, right? We could do something like that. And now we have our little lightsaber blade, and I'm just putting this right over the original image. And then with our mask selected, I could push up this soft edge, and then we have that kind of like glow, right? So that's the basic idea, is we're just pasting a color over this. But I actually want to do this just a little bit different. The reason for this is because this is going to be harder to animate than I really want. I could totally do it. I could start here and then kind of save its position just by going over here to these little diamonds. These are keyframe diamonds. I can click on this keyframe diamond here for center and angle. And that's going to remember the angle and the center of this mask. And then I could go one frame over and I could move this over and change the angle and kind of position that to be just right. And then if I hit left and right bracket, I can kind of go in between these two frames. And so we're kind of adding this lightsaber for each frame. And I could do that, but it's actually going to be a little bit harder to do that with this rectangle than another way of doing it. So I'm just going to get rid of the rectangle. And we're going to do the same idea, but instead I'm going to use a polygon mask, which is just a way to draw directly on an image like with a pen tool. And so you can make your own custom shape, which is great. But one thing I can do with this polygon mask is I can just make one point at the bottom and one point at the top like this. And then I can push up this thing called border width. And look what happens. We get this little line that we can control the thickness of, and I can adjust how big it is and its direction and everything really easily. Okay. And by default, a polygon mask already has keyframe on for the shape animation. I'm just going to go to this fourth little tool up here at the top of my viewer. It says modify only, just so I don't accidentally add any more points. And I'm just going to move this over to cover that lightsaber. And then I can go to the next frame and just put this where it's supposed to be, and so on and so on. And you kind of go through and you trace this lightsaber every single frame. And you might say, wow, that's a lot of work. Visual effects. But now we have this animated lightsaber. And if we go through this entire sequence, we'll have a cool little lightsaber looking thing. And of course we can soften the edge and that kind of thing. But that's kind of the beginning of this effect. That's kind of how we're going to do it. So then we pretty much walk through this entire shot. And a smart way to do it is to actually go all the way to the end of the major movement and kind of move this like this so that it somewhat moves close to where you want it to be. And then you just kind of make it a little better. Kind of go in the middle of these two keyframes. Anytime there's a little tick right here, that is a keyframe. That's basically telling Fusion that you want a property to be a certain value at a certain time. So at frame 57, I want this to be right here. Frame 55, I want it to be right here. And that's how you animate a lot of stuff in Fusion and pretty much anything you can animate things in. So yeah, I'm just going through the major movements here. And again, going in between these two keyframes. And adjusting this to be just right. And eventually for this kind of shot, we're probably going to have a keyframe on every single frame. I can step through the frames with left and right bracket on the keyboard. Just makes it a little bit quicker. Okay, and now we have the entire lightsaber animated. But, you know, it doesn't look very good. This lightsaber is just this blue. And to make it look like it's actually light, we need to have a white core on it. And so what we can do is just make a new background node. This is going to be a white background. And I'll hit F2 to rename this. We'll call this white underscore BG and put that over everything. And we could just copy and paste this mask and change it a little bit. Or I can even hit Control C and then double click off of this and hit Control Shift V. And what that'll do is that'll add an instance. So an instance is like a copy of a node with linked properties. And so if I connect this to our white background, we have the white moving exactly the same way as the blue. We could also, if we wanted this to be exactly the same, we could connect this same mask to the mask input of the white, and that would also do it. But I want to do this with an instance. The reason for that is because I want it to be almost the same, but I want to change a couple of properties. So I'm going to select this instance polygon and go up here, and we'll see all these things in the inspector are highlighted green. That means that they're linked with an instance. And if you right click on any of these properties, you have a bunch of different options, but I'm going to select deinstance on border width, and on soft edge, I'm going to right click and say deinstance. This is going to let me adjust my border width and my soft edge to be different on the white than the blue, but all the other properties and animation and everything are going to be exactly the same. So I'm just kind of selecting what I want to be unique in between these two masks. This is a fantastic way to work with multiple masks. And you can do this with any node. You can copy and paste an instance. And so let's actually take this soft edge up a little bit, take the border width down a little bit. And so now we have this much brighter looking saber, just because we have that white on top of it. So it's just kind of a trick. So now we have this lightsaber. And check this out. This is so cool. Boom. Yeah. So cool. Ah, so much fun. So we can change that and adjust that as much as we want, but that's basically how you would make a lightsaber in Fusion. And if you're super into this, let me know in the comments and I'll make a super deep dive video on how to make this Star Wars scene and do all the fancy compositing in Fusion and everything, because it's a huge deep world. And it's really fun. But yeah, so that's the kind of cool stuff you can do in Fusion. And of course, we would do a similar thing for this other lightsaber, and we can make his lightsaber red or whatever color we want. So Fusion is great for things like this for visual effects, but it's also good for motion graphics. Check this out. I can go up to my media pool here, and I'm just gonna, under my master folder, let's make a new bin. I'm just right clicking and saying new bin. We'll call this GFX for graphics. Double click this to open it, right click in here, and I'm just gonna select new Fusion composition. Now, what we've done so far is we've taken a Fusion composition from the timeline, but we can actually make a Fusion composition here in our media pool that's kind of a reusable asset, okay? So if I hit new Fusion composition, and we'll call this GFX1 for graphics1 and hit create. Then I can double click on this and that's gonna open up my Fusion comp here in Fusion. And the only difference is we don't have a media in. That's because we don't really have any footage we're starting with. It's just an empty comp with a media out. Whatever we connect to the media out is what we're going to see whenever we drop this into a timeline. Let's just start with a background node and connect this into media out like this. And let's make some kind of cool graphic. We're going to keep it really simple for this one, but you can go absolutely crazy with this. Let's just make some text, just dragging some text into the comp, and I'll take the output and merge it over our background. And we'll call this the first Jedi. Yeah. Let's pick a font that we all have. How about Open Sans Condensed? Push up the tracking a little bit, push up the size a little bit. Sure. There are so many cool graphics techniques that I don't have time to get into right now, but let me show you a really big bang for your buck trick that I think is so cool. Let's grab this second node over here, this fast noise. And I'm just gonna actually get rid of our text here and plug the fast noise into the merge. What fast noise does is it generates clouds. And so if I select fast noise and I push up the detail here, push down the scale, you can see we're making clouds. This is just like a cloud texture that it makes. And you can also animate it with seethe like this. You can push it back and forth, or you can push up seethe rate and it will animate over time as you play it back, okay? So that's really cool. I'm gonna take this seethe rate down a little bit just so it's not quite so fast. There we go. So it's just changing a little bit. Maybe bring up the scale just like that. And we could also animate the center to kind of have this move back and forth. And at the beginning, I can just push the center over a little bit and hit this keyframe diamond. And then at the end, I'll push this over a little bit like that. So now when we play this back, we have this changing and floating to the right a little bit, right? So that's nice. Now let's take this and let's only draw this where the text is. So it's like we're just looking through a window that's text shaped and we can see these clouds. An easy way to do this is take the output of our text and plug that into the mask input of our fast noise, okay? So we're just saying draw the fast noise only where the text is. One thing we might want to do is play with the scale just so we can kind of see the clouds a little bit. Also might take the brightness down just a touch. So now we can see the clouds behind the text. That's neat. I'm actually going to take the scale up just a little bit and push the seethe rate up a little bit more. It's like you can kind of see smoke behind the letters. Ah, so neat. So this is really simple, really easy, but we have some nice, cool looking letters here. Let's animate these letters real quick. At the beginning of this, just at frame 0, add a keyframe to our tracking. And then at the end, I'm going to push the tracking up just a little like this so that throughout the shot, it kind of spreads out. And we see the fog behind it. That looks cool. So now we have this reusable title, and anywhere we want to use it, we can just grab this title and drag it into our timeline, just like footage. There's the first Jedi. Oh, baby. Okay. The first Jedi. Yeah, cool. And so Fusion is great for making graphics. It's great for visual effects. I have tons of videos on this. And again, if you want to learn Fusion, dude, I would love to teach you Fusion. I have all kinds of videos for free on YouTube. I also have a super in-depth beginner course for Fusion that's proven itself time and time again to take somebody who doesn't know anything about Fusion, can't make graphics, doesn't know VFX, and turns them into somebody who's comfortable working with Fusion and can make things right out of their mind, can do cooler things in Resolve because they know Fusion. It's so inspiring, and I would love for you to be part of it. There are links to our courses down in the description. I'll even drop a link right there for our free course, which is a perfect place to start the 9 nodes that you need to make almost anything in Fusion. That'll teach you the basic building blocks. All right. Now, let's assume that we've done all of our visual effects. We've just gone crazy with Fusion. We've had such a good time and everything is looking beautiful. We've went in here and replaced the sky and added mountains and TIE fighters and all kinds of cool stuff. And we've cut out my head and replaced these lightsabers and added a little droid in there and done all these kind of cool things in Fusion. Now it's time to jump into color. So to bring this timeline into the color page, all I do is go down here and click on color. And that brings up that same timeline here in the color page where we can work with it. So let's take a look at the interface of the color page. First, we have our viewer, which again is what the person who watches our movie is going to see. Down below that, we have our clips, which are just thumbnails from each clip. And so you can select each clip separately that's in your timeline. Down below that, we have our mini timeline. That's just a way to navigate where the heck you are in the actual timeline. This is something I don't use a lot. And so most of the time I'll just go up here to our buttons and just close timeline, just because it gives us a little bit more screen space, a little more room. And below the clips in the timeline, we have our color palettes. Now, this is like where the major work in the color page happens. And I know this can be really overwhelming for some people. You look at that and go, wow, this is like sitting at the helm of a spaceship. I don't know even where to start. There's so many buttons, and the more buttons you click, the more stuff shows up, and it's just, oh my gosh. But don't worry. The way this is laid out is actually really nice because you can keep this extremely simple if you're just kind of barely into color, or you can go super complicated if you're a total nerd. In fact, I'm not even going to show you all of this in this video because you honestly, for a crash course, I mean, you don't really need to know all of this stuff. I'm going to show you the bare minimum essentials to make cool videos in Resolve. And the great part is you're looking at it. This right here, this palette, which by the way, if you have kind of a different layout here where you only have curves and wheels and you don't have this right part, or whether everything's all in just one big wide section, that's dependent on the resolution and the scaling of your screen. So if you have a 1080p monitor, it might look different than mine. If you have a 4K monitor, it might look different than mine, depending on how you scale your UI in your OS and in Resolve. There's a bunch of things. Might look a little bit different on your MacBook than your wide aspect ratio monitor. The good news is that you'll have all of the same palettes as I do, with the exception of some of these palettes like the 3D palette and the motion effects palette that are only available in the paid version of Resolve. But everything I'm going to show you and go into detail with here is in the free version. Okay. So this third button over, this color wheels button, that opens up our primary color wheels palette. And this is where if you're only going to use one thing in the color page, you should use this palette. It's so important because this is where you can do, 80% of what you need to do in the color page without even knowing that much about color. And there's really only 3 different controls in this whole palette, which is interesting. There's a color wheel control, which if I grab this in the middle, I can drag, and that just pushes color into the image. There's the master wheel, which is like this little slider down here. You can think of it like a steering wheel put on its side and you're kind of looking at the top of the wheel. You can grab this and push it to the right. That makes things brighter. Push it to the left. That makes things darker. You can reset with this little circle arrow. And then we have these little numbers around here. These are called the primary controls. And so for instance, saturation, if I grab this number and drag it to the right, it makes my image more saturated. If I drag it to the left, it makes it less saturated. And that's how all of the controls work there. There's only 3 different kinds of controls. So why are there so many different ones? Well, offset is designed to adjust the entire image all at once. Okay, so if I want to make the entire image pink, I can push pink into the image. The farther I push away from the center, the stronger that pink is. Okay, same for the other colors. And if I grab the master wheel, it makes things brighter or darker. But I'm using the controls under offset. Offset adjusts the entire image, like the image as a whole. We have similar controls here for lift, gamma, and gain. And these just have a stronger effect on different parts of the image, okay? So lift is a lot stronger in the darkest parts of the image. So if I push lift blue, it's going to make the whole image blue, but it's going to be a lot stronger in the darker parts, okay? Gain is the opposite. If I take the gain and I push that blue, it's going to be a lot stronger here where it's a little bit brighter, and it's going to be a little bit more subtle here in the shadows, okay? Gamma is the in-between. It's like the midtones, right? So if I push that, the things that are kind of more middle brightness, those are going to be affected a lot more than the brightest and darkest parts of the image. And that split is true for both the color wheel as well as the brightness. So if I push up the brightness for the gain, it's going to make the brighter parts brighter. Lift, if I take this down, it's going to make the darker parts darker. And so I can push the lift way down and we still have some brightness here. Whereas if I take the gain way down, it's a very different kind of thing. It just kind of makes the whole image just darker because we're taking the brightest parts and darkening them. Okay. So that split is really, really important. And literally just knowing that, you can do so much to the image. Okay. For instance, I'll resize this so we have a little more room here. Let's say I want to make the brighter parts more yellow. Because I want to adjust the brighter parts, I can go to gain. And because I want to make them more yellow, I can push this towards yellow. And so I'm making the brighter parts more yellow, right? What if I want to make the shadows cool? I can go to lift and push that to be a little bit more cool. So I have a lot of control over my image that way. And all of these little controls around here are just little extras. So you can take your contrast and push it up to the right. That's going to add more contrast to the image. Pivot is sort of related to contrast. I can move this back and forth. And because the contrast is like how big of a difference between the lightest parts and the darkest parts of the image, the pivot defines where that break is, like what it considers bright versus dark. And so if I push this down a little bit, it's going to make more things bright, but it's going to keep that same contrast. And same thing, if I push it up, it's going to keep the same contrast, but more things are going to be pushed darker. And so contrast and pivot work together. I can double click on any of these words to reset them. I have temperature, which is just kind of an overall blue versus yellow. Tint, which is an overall green versus pink, green versus magenta. I have saturation, which is how strong the colors are. Color boost, which is sort of like saturation, but it kind of protects the more saturated colors. It's more of like the colors that are less saturated. If you push up color boost, it's going to saturate just those in a little bit stronger way. Then we have shadows and highlights, which you can kind of think of as a master wheel in between lift and gamma and gain. So it's not the very darkest parts, it's just the darker parts of the image. And then highlight is not the very brightest parts, but the brighter parts of the image. I don't use these very often, but they can be useful if you're wanting to adjust your contrast a little bit just with the primaries. And then we have the hue, which controls what color things are. And there's a couple other controls, but those are the main ones. And so now just knowing this part of the primaries, you have so much control over your image. I mean, you could color grade just about a whole movie and get pretty good results, literally knowing what you know now. Okay. Y'all don't believe me? Check this out. Here's our first shot. I'm going to go ahead and reset this color grade for this shot just by right clicking up here in the nodes and say right click, reset all grades and nodes. We'll get to the nodes here in a second. It's not really important right now. What's more important is how you can color grade your movie without a whole lot of effort. So first of all, we got to think, how do we want this movie to look? Do we want it to look kind of darker like this or lighter like this? Which one is closer? And I do like this kind of darker look. And so I think we're going to go with something like that. And so we're actually going to kind of back up in a few minutes, but I want to show you kind of the basic workflow for matching some shots, right? Let's say we really like this and it looks nice. What I can do is I can match all the other shots to look like this. A great way to do that is to right click here and say grab still. And that is going to put a still here in our gallery. And what's cool is I can go to a different shot and I can right click on this still and say play still. And I can have a wipe here so I can compare the colors. And so for instance, this background and grass and shadows and everything, I want that to look pretty similar, probably in between these two shots. And so I can adjust this shot, like just take the offset and probably push the offset down a little bit and get a much closer match for my shots here. So now I have these both looking a little bit closer. This is maybe a little bit too dark on this guy, but we'll deal with that in a few minutes. Let's go to our other shot here and we're going to do a similar thing. I'm just going to roll this around until I get good comparison. And again, I'll take the offset and maybe push this down just to be comparable with that other shot. And let's say that's good. So now we have this kind of dark look throughout our movie. I'll take this one and go down also. Maybe this one's a little bit too yellow. We can kind of take this temperature down and make it a little bit cooler. Same thing here for this shot. Take this down a little bit, maybe make it a little cooler. So now I can go up here to the upper left and click on this image wipe right here to get rid of that image wipe. So now as we play this back, all of the shots match together a little bit easier, right? And this isn't perfect. I'm just showing you quickly how it works, but these shots match a lot better than they did before that were all kind of different brightnesses and everything like that. And you can really go through and make sure everything's matched the way that you want. And so like, think about how powerful that is to be able to go in and make all of your shots basically match with just one panel. Like, look at all these other little panels and everything there are. There's so much other stuff here in the color page, but this is really all you need for basic stuff. And it's actually a lot quicker than other ways of doing color, which sometimes involve dragging a color correction effect to a clip, you know, in your editor and then having to open up your inspector and adjust stuff. This is so much simpler because you just click on what you want and you're already adjusting it with these palettes down here. And whatever you're looking at, that's what you're adjusting with the color. So nice. Also, just to reiterate, remember that we are working in a color managed timeline here. That means that Resolve is automatically making some initial adjustments to our image, and it's setting us up for success here. If I were to go to my project settings and switch this color science from YRGB color managed back to YRGB, check this out. If I hit save, everything looks bad still. All we've done is just adjust a little bit of stuff here in our primaries, and everything still looks nasty. That's because we haven't transformed our colors into the right color space. So don't miss that part, okay? Go up here, go to project settings, under color management, under color science, make sure you check DaVinci YRGB color managed and hit save. And make sure that any footage that you have in your timeline, you can just shift select all of this footage if you want to, right click, and make sure that you have input color space tagged with the right color space for your camera, okay? So for me, it's Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5. Again, if you're shooting a Sony or a Red, it would be something different, right? So far, really all we've done is kind of fix some problems, but we haven't been very creative. All we've done is make sure that these shots roughly match each other. In fact, I didn't even really spend much time deciding if I like how this shot looks. I just kind of matched other shots to it, which might actually be kind of a problem. So
Whether it's a problem or not, all I've seen so far is really impressive. But I guess that's a no for now.